In the last chapter, we looked at how human was put together through different levels of organization. We looked at cells specifically and all the organelles inside of the cell. If we put all of these types of cells together, we are going to form tissues, and tissues is going to be our main focus for this chapter. And after this chapter, we're going to look at how we put different tissues together to form organs and organ system. And we will look at how these organ systems work together as a whole. In the last section, we talked about how there are different types of cells and how they all have different functions, right? That's what we consider as specialized cells. For example, your skin cells is one type of specialized cells, and brain cells is another type of specialized cells. Once they are specialized, they cannot cross-function. For example, a heart cell can only specialize in pumping blood and cannot send messages like brain cells do. Tissues are composed of specialized cells, so only cells that are already specialized in whatever job that is. And when those specialized cells come together, they will form a structure. And this structure could be like whatever organ that you can think of. For example, the heart, right? So if you put a whole bunch of heart cells together, they will form a heart. And all of these cells will have the same goal, the same specific function, which is to pump blood. In our body, we have 4 different types of tissues. We have epithelial tissues, connective tissues, muscle tissues, and nervous tissues. And in this chapter, we will look at how to identify these tissues, where you can find them in your body, and what exactly do they do for you. First, let's look at epithelial tissues. Epithelial tissues are tissues that cover the surfaces of your body. The main job for epithelial tissues is protection, but they do have some other functions as well. So epithelial tissues are toward the surface. So surfaces like your skin, for example, they cover areas that is more risk to injury, damage, and abrasions. So where in your body that you can think of that could really be prone to injury? Well, skin is one of the obvious one, right? Because you use your skin all the time, you bump here and you bump there. It's at high risk of injury. So you have these epithelial there for protection, but you would also have these epithelial tissues at other places as well. For example, the inside of your mouth, the anus, the vagina, and we're going to talk about how those places are necessary for having such a protective tissue. Another function of epithelial tissue is to control permeability. Remember what permeability means from the cell lecture? Permeability means regulation of what can come in and out of the cell. Since epithelial tissues are the closest to the surface, it can regulate the body. It can regulate what comes in and out of the body. Within epithelial tissues, you also find lots of sensory receptors that connect nerve and help you sense the external environment. These receptors are things like smell receptors, taste receptors, visual receptors type of thing. Without these receptors, as part of your epithelial tissues, you wouldn't be able to sense and connect to the outside world. With epithelial tissues, sometimes the tissue itself grows inward and form these little pocket-like structures. These pocket-like structures are what we call glands. For example, oil glands and sweat glands. Oh, and mammary glands too. These glands are what pumps out chemicals that can be beneficial for your body. For example, pumping out sweats can help with thermal regulation, which is to help with body temperature regulation when we are too cold or too hot. Now let's look at some of the characteristics of epithelial tissues. As I mentioned, epithelial tissues are more toward the surface. So, for example, when you touch your skin, the outer part of your skin that you can touch with your hand, that is the outside surface. So toward the surface is toward the skin. Epithelial tissues can also line the organ's lumen as well. The lumen of an organ refers to the empty part that is part of the tube. So if you have something with a tube, right? So if this is a tube, this in here is the lumen, the empty parts that you can actually store things inside. That could either be food or that could be blood. Depends on if that is an intestine or blood vessels. So epithelial tissues would line that part. Since the main function of epithelial tissues is for protection, epithelial tissues need to be really tightly packed together. They want to hug each other really tight. So bad things that we don't want for our body, like bacteria or viruses or any of that bad stuff, can't easily get in. So it's they by forming a tight layer, they form a very protective layer. And these cells of epithelial tissues, they besides tightly packed together, they also like to be on top of each other. So they pile on top, layers after layers. This is really a strong characteristics for protection. It's kind of like, think about your skin when you walk around and then you bump your arm somewhere. Well, you're gonna scrape off some tissues. If you only have one layer, then once you scrape that off, then it's gone. Then now you're gonna be in trouble, right? So by having multiple layers, you're going to have extra protection. Even if you scrape off one layer, you still have some other layers left for protection. Another characteristics of the epithelial tissue is that it has the top layer and the bottom layer. The top layer and the bottom layer are slightly different from each other. This is called polarity. Polarity means both sides is different. The apical surface or the apical layer here is exposed to the free surface. So the part that's outside here, those are free surface because I guess they're free, And the basal membrane is the bottom layer here. This layer helps connect the epithelial tissue to the underlying connective tissue. This is how your body is able to hold the epithelial tissue to your body. One interesting fact about epithelial tissue is that they are avascularized. Remember, in your Latin root, a means without or no, right? So avascularized means without blood vessels or without blood supplies. That means epithelial tissues have to take nutrients from other tissues, in this case, the underlying tissues, connective tissues. Connective tissues are very vascularized. They have a lot of blood supplies to it. So remember how we say things move from high concentration to low concentration? In the epithelial tissues, because you have so much blood supplies there, that area is considered as concentrated. So these blood supplies would slowly diffuse to the epithelial tissues via the process of diffusion that we looked at in the previous chapter. And pretty much you can think of it as epithelial tissues are stealing these nutrients from connective tissues. But I mean, that's how the body works. High concentration to low concentration. Another thing, since epithelial tissues are prone to injury, they have the potential to divide and replace their population really fast. In other words, they are one of the best regenerative tissues. They can multiply and divide and make more of themselves once they feel that they need more, or because of an injury or abrasion or anything like that. In other simpler words, epithelial tissues can heal pretty fast. Now, come to the most difficult part of this chapter, which is identifying the tissues. On the exam, I will give you pictures of tissues, and you are expected to tell me the name of the tissues, their function, and where you can find these tissues. Basically, the things that I asked you guys to do in lab. Anyways, to identify tissues, we are going to use two characteristics of epithelium, which is the layers and shapes. In terms of layers of epithelial tissues can either have one layer or many layers. One layer refers to this term called simple. If your epithelium only has one single layer thick, then we call that a simple epithelia. The fancy word for one layer is simple because it's so simple, it only has one layer, right? If the epithelium has any more than one layer, so 2+ layers, okay? 2+ layers, you are going to call this stratified. Stratified is the fancy terms for many. Now, come to shapes of tissues. We have 3 different shapes. We have squamous, which is flat, squished looking cells. Cuboidal means the cell looks like a square. It looks like a box, like a cube. Versus columnar, or cells that looks like a column. They're really tall. Tall cells are columnar. But identifying shape could be really hard if there are multiple layers, right? So for example, in this tissue here, you have some square looking shapes, and then you also have some flat tissues up here. So which shape do you use, right? The rule is that if you have more than one layer, you only use the top layer. We don't care what the bottom layer is. I don't care if it's square, if it's tall, if it's whatever. All I care about is the top layer. As long as the top layer, in this case here, is flat, then it's going to be squamous. If the top layer is square, it's going to be cuboidal. If the top layer is tall, it's going to be columnar. The bottom layers don't matter. Just the top layer if you have to call out a shape for multiple layers tissues. Now, let's look at some real tissues. What do you think this tissue is? So, first of all, you have to look for what is the bottom layer and what is the top layer. If you can't tell what is the bottom and what is the top, then you don't know what you're looking at. Okay? So in this case here, first we need to look for the apical layer, which is the layer that is exposed to the free surface. Okay, so right here we have free surface. The surface that doesn't have anything to it. Okay, that's the free surface. If you find the free surface, then that is the apical layer. Okay, once you got to the apical layer, the basement membrane is really easy to find because it's the layer that connects to other tissues. So in this case here, this one right here is the basement membrane. Oh my god, I can't spell. Membrane. And these other tissues that you see here is actually connective tissues that we're going to talk about later. But in terms of identifying epithelial tissues, you find the basement membrane and the apical layer, and whatever in between that is your epithelial tissue. Now, once you find which part is your epithelial tissue, now you look for the layers. How many layers do you think the cell has? Let me point it out for you real quick. That's one cell. Here's cell number 2. Here's cell number 3. Here's cell number 4. These are actually the nucleus of the cell. So how many layers? One layer. What's the term for one layer? Simple. So that's the first word that you put, simple. Now, the next job is to identify the shape. What is the shape of this cell? Does it look flat to you? Does it look like it's a square shape? Or is it tall? Okay. I would say this is tall types of cells. So they are columnar. Okay, that's the second word. You have the layer plus shape plus the last word is epithelial tissue. Okay. And now you have your official name. Simple columnar epithelial tissue. And that's what you have to write on the exam. The layer, the shape, and epithelial tissue, or connective tissue, or muscles, or other types of tissues. These ones are the 4 types of tissues that you have to fill in the blank. Okay, now the next tissue. What is this tissue? How do you come up with a name for this tissue? Same method. First, find the 2 layers, the apical surface and the basement membrane. How do you find the apical layer? You look for the free surface. Okay. Once you find your free surface, the layer that's right under that is your apical layer. Okay. And the basement membrane attaches to other tissues, right? So these are the other tissues. So the basement membrane is that one right there. Now, after you found the apical surface and the basement membrane, you found your epithelial tissue. So in here you have 1 cell, 2 cell, 3 cell, 4 cell, and so on, right? These are the nucleus. So looking at the cell, how do we name this? What's the first word? Layer, right? The first word is layer. How many layer? 1 layer. What's the term for 1 layer? Simple. Okay. What's the next word? We have to look for the shape to identify the next word. What is the shape? Is this cell flat, tall, or square? This cell looks square to me, so they're going to be cuboidal. Actually, like that. And then you add in the types of tissue. So in this case, it's the epithelial tissue. So the final name is simple cuboidal epithelial tissue. Now let's look at this cell here. or tissue here. We use the same method. If you learn the method, you will be able to identify any tissue. First, we have to find the apical and the basement membrane. How do you find the apical layer? You have to look for the free surface. So that means this layer right here must be the apical layer. Okay. And the basement membrane is right on the bottom of that, connecting to other tissues. And that's the basement membrane. Okay. And anything in between that is your epithelial tissue. Okay. And the first thing that we use is layer, right? So how many layer? Well, too many to count. So I'm just gonna say stratified. As long as it's more than one layer, it's stratified. I don't care how many layers, it's going to be stratified. Okay, how many shapes? What is the shape? Okay, so when you look at shapes, in the bottom of the tissue, there could be, a lot of different shapes. But really all we care about is the very, very top layer, the layer that is the closest to the apical layer. This is the importance of knowing the apical and the basement membrane. You see how these cells down here, it could be square? If you thought that the bottom here is the apical layer, then you probably say that this is stratified cuboidal. But this is actually the apical layer because of the free surface. So the cells on top here are the only cells that we are going to use as the shape. So in this case, they are flat looking cells. So I'm gonna call that squamous. And of course, we're gonna add the term epithelial at the end. So the final name of this tissue is stratified squamous epithelial tissue. Now let's go over different types of tissues and where you can find them. With simple squamous epithelial tissues, these are very thin tissues. There's only one layer of flat cells in simple squamous. Why do you think you need such a thin tissue? Well, obviously not your skin, right? Thin layer of tissues are really good for diffusion of nutrients. Think about, if you have a very thick layer, how long is it going to take your cells to diffuse its nutrients over? It's going to starve to death by then. So you need a very thin layer to exchange nutrients, somewhere like the alveoli of the lungs, for example, where it needs quick gas exchange. Otherwise, you would not be able to breathe because you ran out of air due to not being able to exchange gas as quick. But with simple squamous epithelium, it fixes the problem. It allows diffusion of nutrients very, very rapidly. Same thing with blood vessels. You would also need a simple layer of tissues like simple squamous, so that when the blood deliver nutrients to other tissues, the nutrients can quickly diffuse over to the tissues and the tissues can get the nutrients immediately. You can find simple squamous epithelial tissues at other places as well. Things like the lining of your body cavities, those serous membranes that we kind of talked about last time, pericardial sac, all of those. Basically, the whole point is to allow things to come in and out quickly, controlling permeability kind of thing. Stratified squamous epithelial tissues are multi-layer of flat cells. Their main function is to protect your body from physical damage. When I ask questions like, where can you find this tissue? Always think about structures and function. Why do you need this place here to be having multiple layers versus the other place to only have one layer? What is the purpose of that, right? So in terms of having multiple layers, obviously we need it for protection. So where in your body that you need to be protecting? Well, you need to protect your skin, right? Because your skin is very prone to injury, and there's a lot of chemicals and pathogens and bacteria around in the environment that want to get into you. So you need this thick layer of protection to keep all of those bad stuff away. The inside of your mouth, your oral cavity, also needs this stratified squamous epithelium tissue, because when you eat something, you have your food in your mouth, right? And then you start to chew on it. The food is going to move around in your mouth, and that moving around, it's likely going to scrape tissues off of your inner mouth. And by having a stratified squamous epithelium layer in the inside of your mouth, you can help protecting your mouth. Not just your mouth, your esophagus, your anus, the vagina, all of this also needs protection. In terms of the anus, feces is going to come out, right? And as it comes out, it could potentially scratch the wall of your anus as well. The vagina, sexual intercourse could be rough, and it could scratch the wall of the vagina. So you want those areas to be covered in a thick layer of cells, which is stratified squamous epithelium. The slight difference between stratified squamous epithelial tissues at the skin versus the oral, anus, and vagina is that the anus, vagina, and the mouth don't have a layer of keratin, which contributes to the water resistant aspect of skin. Only skin has keratin as one of the layer, so we call that keratinized stratified squamous epithelial tissues, versus the other types of tissues, we call them just stratified squamous epithelium. Simple cuboidal epithelial tissues are one layer of cube cells. They are found in glands, which are the epithelial tissues that grow inward and form these little pocket-like structures. These could be things like sweat glands and oil glands, for example. Simple cuboidal also line tubes-like structures, things like the nephron of a kidney as well. Since glands secrete things, so obviously the main function of this tissue is secretion and absorption. Stratified cuboidal epithelial tissues are two layers of cube cells, as you can see here. So that's the lumen, so that's the apical surface, and you divide that in half. So right here, that's one layer, and that's another layer of cuboidal cells. Stratified cuboidals are actually really rare in your body. There's not that many places has it. One of the place that you can find it is the lining of some duct, part of the pharynx, for example, or your throat, the urethra, which is the your pee canal, I guess. Sorry for the lack of words. Its main function is to secrete and absorb. Secretion and absorption with some minor protection, as they do have some multiple layers. They do have multiple layers. So if they have multiple layers, they're going to do some sort of protection. But of course, not as much as stratified squamous, because if you look back, stratified squamous has so many layers, like you can't even count that. Simple columnar epithelial tissues are one layer of thin, tall cells. They often have microvilli, which are extensions of the cell. So they're kind of like finger-like extensions, which are microvilli, which you can see in this layer here. that is the thick layer of microvilli that you can see on top. Actually, let's just do half of that so you can see it. These microvilli function to increase surface area for absorption and secretion. Where do you think that you need more room for absorption? The intestines, right? And the stomach, obviously. You need room to, you need as much room as possible to absorb all of the goodies that you had from your food. And the simple columnar can be found in other places as well, such as the gallbladder and some of the kidney tubes, but its main place is the intestines and the stomach. Stratified columnar epithelial tissues are multi-layer of tall cells. So if you see here, here's the lumen, right? So this here's the apical surface. Down here is the basement membrane. Here's one layer, and down here is another layer. So you only look at the top layer. In this case, they are tall, as you can see. So they are stratified columnar epithelial tissue. Since this tissue has multiple layers, one of its main function is protection, well, some degree of protection, not as protective as stratified squamous epithelial, but protective enough to protect your throat, which is the pharynx, and some glands like mammary gland and salivary glands. They're mainly in glands. Okay, there are a few types of special cells or special tissues. We have pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial tissues. Sounds a lot, right? But every single one of these words actually means something. If you put the words together, the meaning is pretty much there. Pseudo basically means false. And stratify means multiple layers, right? Pseudostratify means that this cell or this tissue looks like it has multiple layers of cells, but in fact, it doesn't. It only has one layer. So for example, like right here, right? You see how it looks like it has multiple layers, but in fact, this here, that's one single cell. It just looks like it has multiple layers, but in fact, they all squeeze together in a way that it looks like it has multiple layers, but it's just one layer. Ciliated means hair. This pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial tissues has these little hair-like structures here. These hair-like structures function to sweep things away, things that you don't want in your body. One special cells in this type of tissues is called mucus cells. What do you think mucus cells secrete? Mucus. Right? So mucus cells secrete mucus, and mucus would trap any bad stuff that you don't want for your body. Something like dust particles, bacteria, viruses, or like anything that comes in your body and you feel like, oh gosh, this is bad. Your tissues will then create a trap, which is the mucus. It would trap those bad stuff, and then the cilia here or the hair here takes over and sweep it, kind of like a broom, I guess, and kind of like clean it out of your way. One very popular location of pseudostratified ciliate columnar epithelial tissues is actually your lower respiratory tract, things like your trachea and your bronchi. Those areas are really prone to particles that you don't want in your body, like dust, right? So you have a lot of these pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial tissues to secrete mucus and trap them and sweep them away. And when they sweep these trapped particles, it's going to move toward the mouth, and eventually you feel the urge to spit it out. These tissues can also be found in your inside of your nose. I mean, when you breathe in, you could breathe through your nose or your mouth, and if things go through your nose, potentially there's dust and all the bad stuff go through as well. So these tissues, once again, would secrete mucus and trap all of these bad stuff, and then the hair or the cilia would sweep it away. And that's actually how boogers form. Your nose boogers, those mucus trapped all the bad stuff, forming boogers, and eventually it's come out. You either pick it or it comes out eventually. And of course, columnar means these cells have columnar shape, or they're tall type of cells. Another type of special cells is, or tissues, sorry, is transitional epithelial tissues. In terms of transitional epithelial tissues, they have the ability to expand and recoil, unlike other types of tissues. Their appearance is also really different, and their appearance change depends on the need of the body. One very popular place is the urinary bladder. These transitional tissues can expand and recoil. When they expand, in the case of when you have a full bladder, it's filled with urine, then it would stretch out the tissues, so it looks stretched and it looks flat. But when the bladder is empty, then it would form these little fluffy flower-like structures. Like how you draw a flower. Please excuse my lack of artistic skills, but these little thing, of how you draw a flower, they kind of look like that here. So if you see something that's fluffy like that, it's going to be transitional. There's no other tissues that looks that fluffy.